The quill did not tremble. That was what everyone remarked upon afterward. In hushed voices at the backs of drawing rooms, in letters sealed with excessive haste and sent across the county before the week was out. They had expected tears, or a dramatic swoon, or at the very least the trembling of a woman who had finally understood the gravity of what she was refusing. What they received instead was stillness. Miss Cecily Vane set the quill down onto the register table with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had made a calculation and arrived at her answer, and she folded her hands before her, and she did not sign. The church held 200 witnesses that morning. Candles burned in sconces along the nave, though the October light already pressed cold and pale through the high windows. The vicar stood with his mouth slightly open. The bridegroom, Mr. Gerald Ashport, had gone the color of old paste. At the far end of the front pew, the Earl of Renmore stood apart from the assembled guests, his dark coat unmarked by a single festive touch, his face arranged into an expression that revealed nothing. He had not been invited to stand where he stood. He had arrived at the church 20 minutes before the service and taken that position without explanation, and the ushers had not dared to question him. No one in the church looked at the Earl. No one permitted themselves to. Every eye was on the woman standing at the register table, and every mind in the room was occupied with the same furious question. What she did not yet know was that the Earl of Renmore had been watching her for 4 months. She did not know that the question the church was asking about her this morning was the least interesting question in the room. Cecily had come to Ashport Hall the previous June as a companion to Mrs. Granthorpe, the senior Ashport cousin who occupied the dower cottage on the estate grounds and required a respectable woman of good family, but reduced circumstances to manage her correspondence, read to her in the evenings, and attend her to the village on her morning errands. Cecily was 22 years old, the third daughter of a Northamptonshire clergyman who had died the previous winter and left 4 daughters, no son, and a living that would revert to the diocese by Michaelmas. She had come to Ashport Hall with one good trunk, a working knowledge of French, and a composed manner that Mrs. Granthorpe had initially attributed to coldness, and later came to understand was the expression of a woman who had learned early that composure was the only form of property she could not be made to surrender. Gerald Ashport had noticed her within a fortnight of her arrival. He was 35, a man of moderate estate and immoderate confidence, who had spent the better part of a decade being assured by his mother and his cousins that he was a highly desirable match. He had not married early because no one had yet impressed him sufficiently. The sight of Cecily reading aloud on the terrace, her voice measured and clear, had impressed him in a way he did not trouble to examine carefully. He had proposed by August. She had accepted. To the county, she was simply a very lucky nobody. The phrase arrived at her through Mrs. Partridge, the wife of the Ashport land agent, who had said it at a card party that Cecily was not attending, but that 2 of the kitchen maids had been near enough to the window to collect and carry below stairs by nightfall. A very lucky nobody. The phrase had a clean, decisive quality that suggested it expressed a settled consensus rather than a single opinion. Cecily had not disagreed with the assessment at the time. She had understood the transaction she was entering. Gerald was not unkind. His mother, Mrs. Edith Ashport, was a different matter. Edith Ashport was 63 years old, a woman who had organized her entire adult life around the management of her son's future, and she had greeted his engagement to a clergyman's daughter with the specific expression of a person who has arrived at the theater and found that the bill has been changed without notice. She received Cecily in the yellow drawing room for the formal introduction and looked at her with a long, measuring look that catalogued every inadequacy of dress, connection, and confidence. And then she had said, pleasantly, that it was fortunate Gerald had such a sensible nature, since clearly the match could not be about any of the usual things. Cecily had understood this, too. She had thanked Mrs. Ashport for her welcome and held her teacup steady, and said nothing more than was required of her. It was the Earl of Renmore who had made her think that understanding the transaction might not be sufficient. He had arrived at Ashport Hall in early September to conduct business with Gerald regarding a shared boundary dispute, a matter that required several meetings over as many weeks, and that resulted in the Earl's presence at the Hall for portions of 3 consecutive Sundays. Cecily had encountered him first on the second of those Sundays, in the long gallery at the east end of the house, where she had retreated after morning prayers to avoid a half-hour of Edith Ashport's company. He was looking at the portraits. He turned when she entered, assessed her with a directness that was not quite rude because it contained no unkindness, and said, "I did not know anyone was in here." "Nor I," Cecily said. She had expected him to leave. He was James Calloway, Earl of Renmore, a man of 38 who had not been seen at a social gathering of any description for 2 years, whose title sat on him with the specific gravity of a thing he had not asked for and had not yet found a way to put down. He was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temple, and a face that would have been called stern by anyone who had not looked long enough to see that what lived behind the sternness was something closer to grief. He did not leave. He resumed looking at the portrait he had been examining, a minor 18th-century landscape of the southern grounds, and said, without looking at her, "You read well." Cecily said, "I beg your pardon?" "Yesterday evening. You were reading aloud to Mrs. Grandthorpe on the lawn. I was walking near the garden wall." He paused. I did not intend to listen. She thought about saying something gracious and dismissing the observation. Instead, she said, "What were you reading yourself, in the long gallery at 11 in the morning?" He turned and looked at her directly for a second time, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost something. He said, "Nothing. I find the portraits restful." She understood this more than he knew. She said, "The woman in the blue dress in the third panel looks as though she has made up her mind about something." And she moved to stand beside him, at a proper distance, and they looked at the portrait together for 3 minutes without further conversation, and when he finally excused himself, it was with a slight inclination of the head that Cecily could not have described precisely, but did not forget. If you have ever seen a door you believed locked stand slightly open, you will know something of what that 3 minutes did to her. The difficulty was that Cecily did not permit herself to know it. Her situation was exact, and her understanding of it was exact. She was a clergyman's daughter with no portion and no prospect, engaged to a man who offered her a household and a position in the county, and any sensation produced by a 38-year-old widower standing beside her in a portrait gallery was a sensation she was under no obligation to honor. She folded it away the way she folded every other thing she was not permitted to want, into the interior part of herself where she had stored 4 months of composure, and she went about her duties. The Earl came to the Hall twice more, and on each occasion he spoke to Cecily for no longer than a few minutes, in settings that were public and unremarkable. He asked about the book she was carrying once. He mentioned in passing a particular poem he had found in the Ashport Library the previous week, and the way he named the poem's title made it clear that he had seen her reading it. Once, on the occasion of a small supper party, he sat 3 chairs away from her at the table and directed no conversation toward her at all. But when the company rose, she felt his attention move with her from one side of the room to the other in a way that she was perfectly aware of and entirely unable to address. Edith Ashport was aware of it too. She raised the matter in the yellow drawing room at the beginning of October, in the particular way she had of raising matters that she had already decided were settled. She told Cecily that the Earl was a man of complicated history who had not acquitted himself well in the matter of his late wife, and that it would be very unfortunate if a sensible young woman in Cecily's position were to form a mistaken impression of what his occasional civility might indicate. She said this pleasantly, as she said everything, while Cecily sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into the expression that had been mistaken for coldness for 22 years. "I am engaged to your son, Mrs. Ashport," Cecily said. "Yes," Edith said. "That is precisely what I mean." Cecily returned to her room that evening and sat for a long while at the small writing desk under the east window, looking at nothing. She was not thinking about the Earl of Renmore. She was thinking about the word precisely, and what Edith had meant by it, and what it indicated about what Edith understood about the engagement her son had entered into. She was thinking about the morning she had accepted Gerald's proposal and the way he had looked at her afterward, satisfied and a little relieved, the way a man looks when he has solved a problem he had been putting off. She was not a woman. She was a convenient arrangement. She had told herself she could live with that. She had believed it to be true until a man stood beside her in a portrait gallery and noticed that she read well, and the belief had begun, quietly and without her permission, to come apart. The night before the wedding, she did not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in Mrs. Granthorpe's spare room, where she had been transferred from the hall at Edith's suggestion that it was more appropriate for the bride not to be under the same roof as the household until after the ceremony, and she looked at the ceiling in the particular way one looks at a ceiling, when one is not looking at the ceiling at all, but at something interior that will not be still. She had given her word. That was the part that pressed hardest, not the prospect of Gerald, who was not unkind, not the prospect of Edith, who was manageable, not even the prospect of the encumbered estate, which was a practical problem with practical solutions. What pressed was the word itself, given in good faith, and what it would cost her to take it back. She thought about her father, who had been a man of considerable principle and inconsiderable income, and who had said to her once, in the last year of his life, that the most expensive thing a person of limited means could own was an honest conscience, and that she would need to decide whether she could afford it. He had said this with a kind of rueful affection that she understood now was his way of telling her he was sorry for the circumstances she would inherit. She could afford it, she thought. She had always been able to afford it. The question was whether she had been willing to pay. She was 22 years old, and she had almost sold herself for security. And the man she was to marry did not know her name in the way the Earl of Renmore knew it, had not looked at her the way the Earl looked at her, and had never, in 4 months of engagement, made her feel that she was anyone in particular. She had accepted this as the terms. She understood now that she had been wrong. The first pale light came into the room at 6:30. She rose and dressed carefully in the white gown, and she pinned her hair, and she looked at herself in the small glass above the washstand, and she said nothing to her own reflection. There was nothing to say. She knew what she was going to do. She walked to the church in the cold morning air with Mrs. Granthorpe beside her, who did not speak, who had the wisdom of 70 years, and understood when silence was the most useful thing she could offer. The letter arrived on the 14th of October. It was addressed to Gerald, written by a solicitor in London, and Cecily would not have known its contents if Gerald had not read it at the breakfast table. And then, in the expansive carelessness of a man who has never needed to watch his words, told her that his mother had been right, and it was a fortunate thing he was marrying a woman who understood her situation, since his finances were somewhat more encumbered than he had perhaps conveyed, and a wife without expectations was a considerable advantage at such a time. She heard the words. She placed her cup carefully on its saucer. She said, "How encumbered, Gerald?" He told her. The number was large. The tone in which he told her was the tone of a man explaining an inconvenience he expected someone else to absorb. He added, as he rose from the table, that she need not concern herself, since her role was the household and his role was the estate, and the two would sort themselves out in time. She sat alone at the breakfast table for some minutes after he left. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the October grounds were the color of rust and gold, and the particular gray of an English sky preparing for cold. And Cecily looked at them and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than by degrees, that she had almost sold herself for a household that was itself already sold. It was not only the money, it was the manner of the telling. The wedding had been set for the 5th of October, then moved to the 22nd, when Mrs. Ashport had required further time to manage the arrangements. On the morning of the 22nd, Cecily rose early, dressed carefully in the white gown that Mrs. Granthorpe had generously contributed the fabric for, and sat for an hour at the east window doing nothing in particular except coming to terms with the country she was entering. She felt very little. This, she understood, was a species of self-protection she had learned young. She did not feel very little when she entered the church. The nave was full. The candles had been lit. The vicar stood at the register table with an expression of professional warmth. And Gerald was at the chancel rail looking prosperous and satisfied. And in the front left pew, Edith Ashport sat with her hands folded over a silk reticule, and her mouth arranged in the expression of a woman receiving exactly what she had arranged. And at the very end of that pew, separated from the Ashport family by 3 clear feet of empty bench, stood the Earl of Renmore. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the east window. His face was as still as it had been in the portrait gallery, and he held his hat in both hands. And the particular quality of his stillness was the quality of a man who had made a decision and was waiting to see whether it was too late. Cecily walked down the aisle. She stood at the chancel rail. She spoke the responses in her clear, measured voice. When the vicar turned to present the register, she stepped to the table, and she took the quill, and she looked at the page. Her name was already written in the preparation column, in the vicar's neat hand. Miss Cecily Adela Vane. In the column beside it, Gerald Thomas Ashport. The ink was dry. The form was complete. All that remained was her signature. She put the quill down. The church did not immediately understand what had happened. There was a moment of collective silence that had the quality of a room still drawing breath. Then Gerald said her name, sharply, in the way he had said it that morning over the breakfast table, and Edith Ashport made a small controlled sound, and the whisper moved through the pews like water finding its level, and someone near the back murmured to their neighbor that the poor creature had simply lost her nerve. Could one blame her? It must be very overwhelming for a girl in her position. Cecily turned from the table. She said, clearly enough to be heard by the first several rows on either side, "I am sorry, Gerald. I find I cannot." He stared at her. "Cannot," he said. The word carried genuine bafflement, the bafflement of a man encountering a variable he had not included in his calculation, because he had not considered it a variable. "I believe," Cecily said, "that we have both entered this arrangement under a misapprehension. I am sorry it has come to this in so public a manner. I am more sorry for that than for anything else. She was not sorry for refusing. She was sorry she had not done it sooner. She was sorry she had needed to come this far down the nave to understand her own worth with sufficient conviction to act from it. Gerald's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. Edith had risen from her pew and was speaking in a low, rapid voice to the woman beside her. The vicar appeared to be consulting the register with great intensity, as though it might offer him guidance on proceedings it had not previously been required to address. Gerald said, with the particular tone of a man revising his understanding of a situation he had considered concluded, "I do not know what you mean by misapprehension." "I know you do not," Cecily said. "I think that is rather the heart of it." The county's assembled witnesses processed this exchange with concentrated attention. In the third pew, Mrs. Partridge, the land agent's wife, had placed her hand on her neighbor's arm. Near the back, a pair of ladies who had traveled from the neighboring village made small, hushed sounds to one another. The vicar had stopped consulting the register and was now looking at the middle distance with the aspect of a man praying for guidance that had not arrived. Gerald said, "You are making a spectacle of yourself. And of me." He said it quietly, which was its own admission that he was less concerned with her welfare than with the 200 witnesses now cataloguing his face. "Yes," Cecily said. "I am sorry for it. I should have been clearer sooner." The word "sooner" landed in the church with a precision she had not entirely intended. She saw it register in Gerald's expression, the slight contraction around the eyes, and she understood that he understood, and that this was the end of the conversation between them. Cecily stood very still at the chancel end of the aisle, her hands folded before her, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was the Earl of Renmore. He did not cross the church in 3 dramatic strides. He moved with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who had decided exactly how far to go and was not going to be rushed into going further. He came to stand beside Cecily with 6 inches of air between them, and he looked at Gerald, and he said, "She is quite right." The misapprehension was material. The church had gone very quiet. Even the whispers at the back had stopped. Gerald looked at him. "You have no part in this, Renmore." "I have a part," the Earl said, "in any proceeding that concerns Miss Vane's welfare." He paused. "She should not be in this church. She should not have been in this church. That is what I came to say." Edith Ashport stepped into the aisle. Her voice was very controlled, the voice she used when she was most certain of her ground. She said that this was a private family occasion, and that the Earl was not a member of the family, and that Miss Vane had made a commitment which was not a matter for outside interference, and that a sensible woman in her position would do well to consider what she was refusing, because girls without connections and without means did not often have the luxury of principles. A very lucky nobody, Cecily thought. There it is again. The Earl looked at Edith for a moment with an expression that was perfectly courteous and entirely implacable. He said, "Miss Vane has the luxury of principles because she has the judgment to exercise them. That is the entirety of the matter." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The sentence landed in the quiet church with the specific weight of a thing that had been a long time coming, and the witnesses in the pews received it with the expressions of people who have heard a thing said clearly that they had known for some time but had lacked the occasion to acknowledge. Edith opened her mouth. Gerald said her name, and she stopped. Something had shifted in the room that she understood could not be unshifted, and she stood with her reticule held before her like a small shield. And she was silent. Cecily looked at the Earl. He was looking at her with the same directness he had offered in the portrait gallery, the quality of attention that assumed she was worth the attention. that did not add up her assets and her deficits, and find her wanting before it bothered to look. She felt a warmth at the base of her throat that she did not try to suppress. She said quietly, "Thank you." He said, "Come outside." It was a command. It had the syntax of a command. It also had everything she needed in it, and she walked with him down the nave and out through the heavy church door into the cold October morning, and the door swung closed behind them on the assembled witnesses and the unsigned register and everything she had nearly become. The churchyard was empty. The yew trees stood very dark against the pale sky, and the gravestones caught what thin light the October sun was offering, and the smell of leaf rot and cold stone was on the air. The very particular smell of an English autumn at a crossroads. The Earl stood beside her, not quite close enough to be a statement, close enough to be a question. Cecily said, "You should know that I did not refuse him for your sake." He said, "I know that. I refused him because I had been dishonest with myself about what I was willing to accept." "Yes," he said. He was looking at the middle distance, at the lane beyond the churchyard gate, his hands clasped behind his back. "I would not have had you do it for any other reason." A brief silence. The yew trees did not move. She said, "Your wife." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor. She died 3 years ago. A fever in the summer, very fast." He paused. "I was in London. Business I had persuaded myself was essential. I received the letter 2 days after she was buried." He said it as a man states a fact he has handled many times and has not yet found a way to put down entirely. "I came back to Renmore, and I closed the house, and I stayed there for 18 months, and I found it did not help." "No," Cecily said. "It would not." He looked at her. "You understand that. I understand that staying somewhere because you cannot face leaving is not the same as being healed. My father was ill for a long time before he died. I understood at some point that grief is not a room you can stand in until it becomes familiar. You have to keep walking through it." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "I have been walking." "Yes," she said. "I know." She did know. She had seen it in him from the first, the quality of a man in motion through something that had not finished with him, and she had recognized it because she had been in motion through her own version of it for most of the past year. She did not reach for him. She was not the sort of woman who reached. She stood beside him in the cold October churchyard and allowed the silence to be exactly what it was. He said, "I have a daughter, 8 years old. Her name is Clara. She's at Renmore with her nurse, and she does not yet know that I came here today." He said it with the precision of a man laying all of his circumstances on a table where they can be examined honestly. She is a very serious child. She reads above her age. She has not had a great deal of occasion for happiness since her mother died, and I believe a portion of that is my fault. Cecily thought about this. She said, "Is she like her mother?" He said, "She is like me." "Which is the difficulty?" The corner of her mouth moved against her will, in a way she suspected was visible. He said, "I am not doing this with any elegance." "No," Cecily agreed. "I have spent 4 months doing it without elegance, from a considerable distance, which is why we are standing in a churchyard on the morning of your almost wedding, rather than anywhere more rational." He turned to look at her directly. "I am asking whether you will permit me to call on you. Formally and properly, with whatever arrangements are appropriate to your current situation, which I recognize is complicated by the fact that you have just refused a man at the altar and will require somewhere to go before the afternoon is out." She had not thought this far ahead. She thought of it now, the practical reality of her position. No household of her own. A trunk in a room at Ashport Hall. Mrs. Granthorpe, who was kind, but could not house her indefinitely. A family in Northamptonshire she could return to, but at considerable cost to everyone's dignity. She thought of the Earl's daughter, serious and reading above her age, alone at Renmore with her nurse. She said, "Mrs. Granthorpe will have me for a few days, I expect, until I have made arrangements." He said, "I will speak with Mrs. Granthorpe." "You will not manage this for me," Cecily said, not sharply, with precision. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "No, you are right." He paused. "I will speak to my solicitor. There are positions available at Renmore, if you were amenable, that would provide you with both a situation and the time to decide whether you are willing to see me under more ordinary circumstances." He paused again. "Governess to Clara. She is in need of one. I am aware that it is an unconventional arrangement, given what I have just said to you in the church. I would not ask you to accept it, if I thought it would be anything other than what I say it is." Cecily looked at the gate at the far end of the churchyard, at the lane beyond it. She said, "Tell me about Clara." He told her. He told her about a child who collected pressed flowers in the margins of her copybooks, and who had a habit of asking questions that were too large for the occasion, and who had once informed her nurse that she did not need to be managed. She needed to be understood. He told her about these things in a voice that was quieter than his ordinary voice, a voice she had not yet heard from him, and she listened to it and felt something in her chest make room for what she was hearing. If you are listening to this, you already know how a thing can be understood before it is named. You already know the particular quality of a decision, arriving not as revelation, but as recognition. She said, "I should like to meet her." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I have not made this easy. I am aware of that." "No," she said. "But easy would not have been honest. And I think we have both had enough of arrangements that were convenient rather than honest." He turned to look at her. The wind had come up slightly, moving the yew branches in the gray October air, and he studied her face with the expression she had learned to recognize across 4 months of watching him from the correct distances. The expression of a man who knows what he is seeing and is choosing, carefully, what to do about it. He said, "Eleanor's portrait is in the study. I have not moved it." He said it as a man lays out the terms of something honestly before asking for an answer. Clara remembers her. She has her mother's way with silence, which is to say it is never quite empty. A pause. "I am not asking you to replace anything." "I know," Cecily said. "I am asking you to add something," he said, "which is a different thing entirely." His voice was very level and very quiet, the voice she had heard from him only in moments of some cost to himself. "I find I am not able to stop thinking about a woman in a portrait gallery who noticed that a painted figure had made up her mind about something, and I am not willing to pretend otherwise merely because the timing is inconvenient." The wind moved in the yew trees. Somewhere behind them, the heavy church door opened briefly on the sound of voices and closed again. Cecily looked at the gate at the far end of the churchyard, at the bare hawthorn beside it, the last of its leaves still clinging to the upper branches the way things cling when they are not quite ready to let go. She said, "I should like to meet her." He said, "Yes." Then he said, "Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name. It arrived in the cold October air with a weight she had not been prepared for, and she did not try to compose herself against it, because composure had cost her enough already, and she was tired of paying for things she ought to have had for free. She looked at him. He did not say anything else. He held out his hand, and she took it, and they stood there in the cold churchyard, her fingers in his gloved hand, the yew trees very dark around them, and the church behind them full of 200 people who were still, at this moment, working out what they had witnessed. The weeks that followed were neither simple nor romantic, in any conventional sense. Cecily went to Mrs. Granthorpe, who was 70 years old, entirely clear-sighted about human nature, and considerably less surprised than anyone might have expected. Gerald Ashport sent one letter, stiff and wounded, and received in return a reply from Cecily that was both honest and kind, and which she imagined he read several times with increasing discomfort, because it contained no unkindness toward him, only honesty about what the arrangement had been and what it had lacked. Edith Ashport said nothing. Silence, from Edith, was the equivalent of a full confession. The Earl called on Mrs. Granthorpe twice in November, on both occasions perfectly formal, and spoke to Cecily for 30 minutes each time in the sitting room with the door appropriately ajar, and said nothing that could not have been reported verbatim to the county's most attentive gossips, without producing anything but reasonable conversation. He brought a book on the second visit. She noticed the title and did not comment on it, but when she glanced up midway through the visit, she found him watching her with a steady, unhurried attention that had nothing formal about it at all. She traveled to Renmore in the first week of December to meet Clara. The child was exactly as her father had described. Serious, watchful, possessed of the disconcerting quality of looking at a person until she had made up her mind about them. And not before. She received Cecily in the morning room with her nurse present and her hands folded in her lap, and she asked Cecily 2 questions before any pleasantries had been exchanged. The first was whether Cecily read Latin. The second was whether she believed that pressed flowers retained any of their original scent, or whether that was merely memory. Cecily answered both questions honestly. Clara considered her answers for a moment, then said that she supposed Cecily could begin on Monday. The Earl, standing in the doorway behind his daughter, looked at the ceiling briefly. The thing that moved across his face in that moment was not quite a smile, but it was close enough that Cecily felt the warmth of it from across the room. The position was entirely proper, the arrangement entirely transparent, and the county was entirely occupied with it for the better part of the winter. Mrs. Ashport, in the yellow drawing room, said to anyone who would hear her that it was exactly what one would expect of a very clever nobody, and that some women had a talent for engineering circumstances in their favor that was quite something to observe. The phrase reached Cecily through Clara, who had been in the corridor outside the morning room at Renmore during a visit from a cousin's wife who had passed it along with the relish of someone delivering news they expected to cause damage. Clara told her with the directness of an 8-year-old who does not yet know that information can be delivered as a weapon. She had heard someone say that Cecily was a very clever nobody, and she did not understand what was meant by it. Because from everything she had observed, Cecily was an extremely particular somebody, and she wanted to know if Cecily was upset. Cecily looked at her. She said, "No." Clara said, "Good. I did not think you would be." It was the second week of December. Snow had begun to fall outside the long windows of the morning room, light and purposeful, the first snow of the season lying clean across the Renmore grounds. The fire was going well, and the light it threw was the warm amber of an interior that had been cold for a long time and was remembering how to be otherwise. The Earl came to the doorway of the morning room at 4:30 with his coat still on, having just returned from a ride, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the 2 of them, his daughter and Cecily, bent over a pressed flower catalogue with their heads close together. He looked at this for a long moment without announcing himself, as a man looks at a thing he has spent considerable time moving toward without being entirely certain he would be allowed to arrive. Then he stepped into the room, and Clara looked up and said, "Papa," and Cecily looked up and said nothing, and he crossed to the fireplace and stood beside it, and the snow fell outside the windows, and the fire made the particular sound of a fire that has been correctly laid and is doing exactly what it was built to do. He said quietly, "Cecily." She set down the pressed flower catalog and looked at him. And what she saw in his face was a man who had been walking through grief for 3 years, and had, this afternoon, arrived somewhere he had not been before. She understood this because she had been walking, too, and the room she had arrived in was the same room, and the snow outside the window was the snow outside the window, and the fire was warm, and his daughter was sitting 3 feet away with her hands folded in her lap, watching them both with the patience of a child who had already decided that she approved. He said, "I find I am done with patience." She said, "I was wondering when." He came to her, across the morning room, and took her hands in both of his. And Clara made a small sound that might have been satisfaction, and turned to look at the snow with elaborate courtesy. Outside, the Wrenmore grounds lay white and still, and the yew trees at the far end of the south lawn held their dark shapes against the pale afternoon sky, and the pressed flower catalogue lay open on the table, and the fire burned on. He asked her in the proper form 2 days later, on the 14th of December, in the presence of his solicitor, and with a letter already dispatched to her eldest sister in Northamptonshire. She accepted him in the quiet voice she used for things that mattered, the voice that had held steady at the register table in the October church, and was holding steady now, for very different reasons. They were married in the Wrenmore Chapel in January, with Clara standing beside her father and Mrs. Granthorpe in the front pew, and a small, select company of those who had earned the occasion. When the vicar presented the register, Cecily took the quill, and she signed her name in a clear, unhurried hand, and she was not trembling, and she did not set the quill down. That winter, in the evenings, Cecily and Clara would often sit together in the long gallery at the east end of the house, where the portraits of the Calloway family looked down from their gilded frames in the amber light of oil lamps newly installed. Clara had developed a habit of narrating what she imagined the painted figures were thinking, which Cecily had encouraged as an exercise in observation, and which the Earl had come to listen to from the doorway, with the expression of a man in possession of something he had not expected and intends to keep. On one such evening in February, with snow still on the ground outside and the fire at the gallery's far end going well, Clara stood before the portrait of a woman in blue 18th century dress with an expression on her painted face that was both resolved and composed, and she said, "She has made up her mind about something." Cecily looked up from the book in her lap. "Yes," she said. "I think," Clara said, studying the portrait with the concentration she brought to everything, "that she decided not to be a convenient arrangement." The Earl, in the doorway, said nothing. He looked at his daughter, and then at Cecily, and Cecily looked back at him, and the lamplight was warm, and the snow lay clean and still on the grounds outside the gallery windows, and the woman in blue looked down at all 3 of them with her composed and decided expression, and was quiet.